What's going on? It's Dr. Chris here, and today I'm starting my podcast series on functional blood chemistry. And I'm, as you may have known, I am studying it right now, and we just finished the blood sugar portion of the blood chemistry, which is fascinating, by the way. So we talked a lot about hyperglycemia and hypoglycemia. And my goal today is to go over some of the markers that you can get on your labs, kind of explain what most of them mean, and then I'm going to go over some of my results, and because nothing was perfect, and kind of review like what my action plan is going to be around it. So just really quickly, so functional medicine, the idea is to try to recognize patterns instead of just looking at individual markers or see, okay, you might be in the quote unquote normal range, but is that optimal? Or are you trending in a way that's not looking good? And can you do something about it before it becomes irreversible? And blood sugar is a primary example. Just to review, when you eat some food with some carbs in it, sugar is in your bloodstream, and then your pancreas recognizes that, and then it pushes insulin into the bloodstream to usher the glucose into your liver and into your muscles, mostly into the muscles. That can be impaired over time, especially as we age. And you can even get what's called beta cell death. So the beta cells are in the pancreas, and those are the ones that secrete the insulin. So over time, if you kind of ignore being pre-diabetic or becoming diabetic, those beta cells stop producing as much insulin, and then you have to become insulin dependent. So it's irreversible at that point. But if you catch it early, you can do something about it. So that's what I want to go over. So I'm just going to sort of list the primary and secondary markers that you'd get on if you had like an in-depth blood panel. You get glucose. So I'm going to talk about two, high or low, what pattern we're looking for things to be out of whack. So glucose would be high. Hemoglobin A1C or HA1C would be high. Fructosamine high. Post-meal glucose high. Triglycerides and LDL high and HDL low. So your cholesterol does play into your metabolic profile. It's really important to know. And then some secondary hyperglycemia markers would be uric acid, which would be high, a fasting insulin high. And then your liver enzymes could be high. So that'd be ALT, AST, GGT, and LDH. So those would all be high. So basically all of them besides HDL would be high, whereas HDL is inverse marker would be low. So let me talk a little about glucose. So you see the lab ranges can go up to 94, 97, depending on the lab. Functional medicine will tighten that window to kind of catch things before it happens. So functional range in the course I'm taking is 75 to 85. It is the least sensitive marker for blood sugar dysregulation, and that's unfortunate because it's kind of the standard one that's used. So glucose basically only tells us about how blood sugar is in a fasted state. And also to keep in mind that stress, lack of sleep, certain drugs, these can all alter your glucose. So you can get a lot of bad reads. So let me go into a little more depth on that insulin release that I was talking about. There's actually two phases. So when you first eat something, when things are working right, you have a first phase response, and that should return your glucose under 100. And if it doesn't, the pancreas kind of pauses, and then 10 to 20 minutes later, there's a second pulse of insulin that's released, and that should return below 100 in a normal person. When that whole process is impaired, usually it's that second phase response that worsens, and that can take up to 4 to 5 hours to restore your blood sugar down to normal. So if you are pre-diabetic and this is happening to you, during the day, you may never have normal glucose because of meal timing, especially if you snack a lot, or you're doing the 6 meals a day type of thing. So the only time that your glucose might be normal is in fasted states, or such as like first thing in the morning. So because that can lead to a lot of false positives. It does go out of whack at a certain point. So it's a decent rule-in test, but a pretty poor rule-out test. And there was a study actually in China where they found patients with dementia, because there's a correlation between dementia and blood sugar dysregulation. In fact, type 3 diabetes is basically from glucose dysregulation. They found that in the study, over 80% of the patients with dementia had fasting glucose over 90. So that's still in the lab range normal. That's in the higher end, but still considered normal. So that just kind of opens your eyes to, okay, well, some of these markers, maybe their ranges aren't quite right. Okay, hemoglobin A1C. So the functional range, 4.6% to 5.3%. So what that is, so sugar is sticky and it sticks to your blood cells, it sticks to the hemoglobin molecule in particular. So that's called glycation. So red blood cells live an average of about 90 days. So this is where there's a strength, there's some weaknesses too. A1C, it's really a measure of, it's like a 3-month average, basically, because those 90 days. So it's got that say you're 5.3% of your red blood cells have been glycated or have sugar stuck to them. So it's a little better than glucose, because glucose is kind of just a snapshot. However, there is variability in blood cell lifespan. So some healthy individuals, their blood cells can live for over 146 days, whereas diabetics, their blood cells lifespan can be like 81 days. So what that means is that A1C can be low in diabetics and vice versa. All right, so that kind of clouds the whole thing. There is another marker that I didn't mention yet called MCV, which means mean corpuscular volume, and this can be used to kind of tease out the A1C issue. So what that is there's variance in your blood cell sizes, right? So they're born big and die small, kind of opposite humans, right? So in other words, a high MCV can mean short-lived blood cells, and a low MCV can mean long-lived blood cells. So if your A1C is high and MCV is low, it could mean that A1C is high due to long-lived red blood cells. So it's an inverse marker. So that can help tease out any issues with your A1C. Now, fructosamine is another marker. So when this goes out of whack, it's high. It's another average marker for blood sugar. So you have proteins that float in your bloodstream, such as albumin, and those get glycated by sugar too. But these proteins only live for about 14 to 21 days. So it's really a measure of blood sugar control over 2 weeks rather than 3 months. It's a cheap test. It's precise. You don't see it often, but it's a good one to get. Probably more accurate than A1C, and it's probably free of interference from some of the blood disorders like anemia that can affect A1C. The only problem, though, is it hasn't been standardized yet. And then the most sensitive marker for blood sugar dysregulation is post-meal glucose, if that's high. There's a number of ways that measure this, and this is the best way to find out where you stand. There is an OGTT test. That's where you basically drink a solution of glucose, and they have basically cutoff scores with that. They see how your blood sugar responds to that. You can get a glucometer. This is probably the best way to do it. Well, there's one other way I like even better. So what that is you get a glucometer and you finger prick yourself, and you measure your glucose before, 1 hour, 2 hour, and 3 hours after a meal. Do that over the course of a few weeks, and you start to see trends. Walmart sells one for $16. It's made by a company called Relion Prime, RELION. The thing to keep in mind, though, there's questions about accuracy. I think I read somewhere you can shave off 10 points, so it could be plus or minus 10 points in either direction. But the whole goal here would be to look at a pattern, not just how you respond to one meal. There's another test called GlycoMark. I'm not going to get into that. But I think really the best thing to do is to get a CGM, a continuous glucose monitor. I did one for a month. I got tons of great information out of it. They can be like $300 to $400. I use one called NutriSense. But basically that gives you real-time data. So you have an app that comes with it, and you'll see exactly how your blood sugar responds according to a meal, after stress, for me, ice bath. Every time I took an ice bath, it would go way down. So that's a really cool tool, and you get a lot of valuable information out of that. And then let's see, I already mentioned the triglycerides, HDL. The triglycerides to HDL ratio, if that's high, that's a bad sign as well, by the way. So those are some other markers to look at. Okay. Now, let's get into some of my blood work. So I was not thrilled with it. Let me back up. I was having some symptoms for a while, for the past couple of years. There's been a fair amount of stress in my life. I started a business, had kids, babies, stuff like that. Probably not sleeping great. Exercise was not doing great. And I developed a wheeze and a cough at night, and it was concerning for a while. And then I also had read a lot about the carnivore diet, and I was interested in that. And I went on it for a good 6 months, and I lost a bunch of weight, and my wheeze and cough all but went away. It was almost totally gone. So I do think it sort of affected some of my lab numbers, which I may dive into later. So just a little background there. So I got tested a few months ago, and here are some of my findings. So for my primary markers, my glucose was in the high range, or was out of range in the functional perspective. So it was at a 94. So it was still quote unquote normal, but still a little bit high. My hemoglobin A1C also out of the functional range, but in the normal range, so a little bit high. I didn't have a fructosamine or post-meal glucose. My triglycerides were high in the functional range as well, but just barely. And then my HDL was a little bit low in the functional range, and my LDL also, that one was high in the functional and the lab range. But I expected that because I'd been on basically a carnivore-based diet. And then my secondary markers, my uric acid was slightly high in the functional range. My fasting insulin also high in the functional range. And then my liver enzymes were all high in both functional and lab ranges, which is concerning. But again, everyone just thinks alcohol when it comes to the liver enzymes, but this is also a indicator of how your metabolic profile is doing. So I had 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 markers out, and most of them were just in the functional range. So what I think this means, not that I can diagnose this myself, so I'm not pre-diabetic, but I'm heading that way. So I'm glad I did this when I did, so I can start to make some changes in my diet and lifestyle. So let me gonna walk you through my plan. This is how you should be thinking about your blood markers too. One thing I haven't dove into it yet because I'm going to do a whole thing on iron. Iron, if it's too high or too low, can cause some issues. There's a big correlation between that and diabetes. And my ferritin levels were high as well. So that also goes into being on a carnivore diet, probably. But there were some other markers too that may indicate that I had some inflammation going on. That may be why. But I'll dive into that more. But so first thing I want to do is get a comprehensive iron panel and just rule out what's called iron overload, because that could explain a lot of this. I'm going to prioritize my sleep and exercise. Exercise is great for insulin sensitivity. Sleep, if you have just even one night of 5 hours of sleep, that can basically put you in a temporary state of being diabetic. So sleep is a big deal. And to that point, I use what's called a Morpheus watch. If you've heard of a Oura Ring or a Whoop Strap, the same thing. It basically tracks your HRV, your heart rate variability, which is an indication of how well rested you are, how recovered you are. So I'll use that as a way to gauge, am I sleeping enough? Because everyone's a little different there. Also with the sleep thing, blue light's a big deal. I'm sure you've probably heard some of Andrew Huberman's labs podcasts. The blue light at night is a big no-no. So I'm going to do my best to avoid cell phones, TV at night. And if I really just want to watch some Netflix or whatever, I'm going to be wearing some blue light blocking glasses. The CGM, I've already done the CGM. I might do a second month of it after I make some dietary changes to see what happens. I will stay consistent with my ice bath during the cold plunge, because consistently that would always drop my blood sugar. One of the things too that I didn't mention, I was a little low in magnesium, and magnesium optimizes insulin production and improves sensitivity as well. So I may consider some supplementation. The other thing too, I noticed when I did my CGM is that green tea would always, like, at least 10 points knock down my blood sugar. So I'll start drinking a lot more green tea. And I mentioned this on other podcasts too. One of the things that would always spike my blood sugar, because stress can do it, is driving. I have a 30-minute commute to work. So that's one of my strategies, is drink green tea while driving to kind of buffer that onslaught of the rise in blood sugar. So I'll retest probably in a few months after these changes. Oh, I didn't mention, I'm also going to go more of like a paleo template for my diet with a 25 to 35% ratio carbs. And I'm going to do mostly fruits and starchy tubers for my carbs. If you starchy tubers such as potatoes, if you cook and cool them, the starch becomes resistant starch and it doesn't have the same negative effect on your blood sugar. So I'll be doing a lot of cooked and cooled potatoes and fruits. So then after a few months of that, I'm going to retest. And if I'm still high, there's a couple other supplements I may consider. I have to do a lot more research on these, but I just want to mention them. And I'm definitely not telling anybody what to do, by the way. Don't just start taking things without having someone look at your blood chemistry. but some that I just want to tell you about because I think they can be powerful. One is berberine, which is apparently as good as metformin. It improves insulin sensitivity. It decreases gluconeogenesis, which is your liver producing sugars. It stimulates the uptake of glucose. So that's on the list of things I may look into. There's another one called Gymnema, which does everything that I just mentioned about berberine, but it may also improve beta cell production of insulin. There's Banaba, fenugreek. There's two other supplements I'm looking to called Glucose Supreme and Metabolic Synergy. They're a little pricey, but if it all fails, I may start to look into those things. So I kind of want to go over this, and this is going to be probably my format for the whole blood chemistry series, and they may be coming out pretty sporadically because it's some pretty in-depth information. But I wanted to talk about it because I think this is how people should be thinking about their blood chemistry. I think a lot of people will just look at their markers, say, oh, my B12 is off, take B12. Well, you got to look at the whole pattern. What's the picture telling you? And then you have to come up with a plan around it. But I think people will just kind of go, well, I'm just going to improve my diet. I got to stop eating all that ice cream at night. Okay, yeah, that's a good idea too. But you should really come up with a full action plan of how you're going to correct it so you don't have to rely on medicine. So I hope you enjoyed this one. Hope it was useful. Email me with any questions, and there'll be more to come soon. Talk to you soon.